One Africa, one passport, one currency, one economy. With that single declaration, Captain Ibrahim Traoré disrupted the African Union's closed-door meeting. No raised symbols, no staged theatrics, just words sharp enough to cut through decades of silence. The room froze. Some leaders leaned forward with guarded hope. Others stiffened in alarm. Outside, the world had no idea what had just been said, because this was more than a proposal. It was the unveiling of a secret long hidden behind the curtains of politics. What does it mean when a young leader dares to challenge the very legacy of Berlin? 1884. Can the dream of Afro money in a borderless continent survive the weight of entrenched interests? Or will it be crushed before it even starts? This is not entertainment. This is a revelation of the power struggles, betrayals, and the quiet war for Africa's soul. A story meticulously kept from public knowledge until this moment. If you believe Africa's awakening has already begun, subscribe and follow this journey to its end. The truth hidden behind political curtains is about to be revealed. The African Union's closed-door session began under the shadow of troubling data. Reports presented to the delegates revealed an uncomfortable truth. Despite decades of independence and repeated promises of integration, Africa remains deeply fragmented. As of the year 2023, intra-African trade accounted for only 15% of the continent's total trade volume. In numbers, that is approximately 182 billion United States dollars in goods exchanged between African nations. By comparison, intra-European trade accounts for nearly 70% and intra-Asian trade surpasses 50%. These numbers are not abstract. They reflect daily realities. Millions of African producers and consumers forced to look outward rather than inward, bound by lines drawn in a European conference hall in the year 1884. The room listened as Ibrahim Traoré spoke in a steady voice. Borders, he said, are more than geography. They are chains forged in Berlin, reinforced through colonial currencies, and still defended by systems that reward dependency. He noted that the African Union had already proposed the idea of a unified passport back in 2016 in Kigali, Rwanda. Yet nearly a decade on, the initiative has not progressed, remaining largely a symbolic gesture, far from its intended goal of genuine mobility for average Africans. Then he presented his most direct challenge, the concept of Afro money. Then came his sharpest challenge, the proposal for Afro money, a single African currency backed not by foreign treasuries, but by Africa's own resources, gold, oil, fertile farmland. Traoré argued that every border crossing, every customs fee, every time a farmer or trader loses profit through currency exchange, Africa grows weaker while outsiders grow stronger. Afro money, he said, would not be a gesture. It would be a shield, a tool for survival, a declaration of dignity. Some leaned forward with interest, others shifted uncomfortably, but none could deny the raw arithmetic. A continent of more than 1.4 billion people, blessed with the largest reserves of cobalt, platinum, and manganese on Earth, and still loses billions each year because it trades with itself less than any other region. This is not a theoretical matter, Traoré stated. It is a demonstrable reality. The numbers speak for themselves. We can continue to obey the map of Berlin, or we can build our own future. The silence that followed was not ignorance, it was calculation. Something in the room had shifted, and everyone knew it. The declaration of one Africa, one passport, one currency, one economy did not hang in the air for long before the first objections erupted. The chamber that had been tense and silent suddenly turned into a storm of voices. A seasoned head of state, one who had ruled for decades, leaned into his microphone and spoke with a heavy voice. This is reckless. A single currency will enslave us to one authority. We have fought too hard for our national independence to surrender it now. His words conveyed a sense of caution, but they also revealed a fear of losing authority. Another minister, who was from one of the continent's major economies in the South, stood up. His counter-argument was more direct and based on technical grounds. Our inflation is already difficult to contain. A single currency without a unified fiscal policy is not only impossible, it is dangerous. He shook his head firmly, dismissing the proposal as a fantasy. The room began to fracture. Some leaders applauded the courage of Ibrahim Traoré, praising him for naming the truth others dared not speak. Others whispered among themselves, fearful that Afro Money might undermine their own fragile banking systems, or worse, provoke retaliation from European capitals that still held deep financial stakes in African treasuries. For every nod of approval, there was a scowl of doubt. For every clap of support, there was a mutter of dissent. One delegate even pushed back his chair so forcefully that it scraped loudly on the floor, startling those nearby. The division was no longer concealed. It was starkly apparent, audible, and undeniable. Traoré listened without interruption. His expression remained calm, but his eyes did not waver. The tension was building, and the lines of fracture within the African Union were beginning to look like cracks in stone. Cracks that might widen into an irreparable break. The question that filled the chamber was no longer whether Africa should unite, but whether it even could. The arguments escalated until the chamber could no longer contain the noise. A handful of delegations, visibly angered, rose from their seats and walked out of the hall. The scrape of their footsteps echoed against the marble floor. Each step was a public statement that unity was not worth the price being demanded. For a short time, an atmosphere of unease filled the room. To some onlookers, it appeared that Ibrahim Traoré had miscalculated his move. Journalists stationed outside the chamber would later describe the scene as the most dramatic fracture within the African Union in years. Yet Traoré did not flinch. When the murmurs settled, he leaned toward his microphone and spoke with deliberate clarity. If unity is dictatorship, then chains must be freedom. The words cut through the chamber like steel. It was a reversal that no one expected, a direct challenge to those who equated integration with tyranny. In that instant, the debate was no longer technical. It became moral. Were African leaders defending sovereignty or defending the invisible shackles left behind by foreign powers? Some heads bowed, while others grew tense. Yet across the continent, as the news disseminated, the reaction was electrifying. Social media platforms in Dar es Salaam, Lagos, and Nairobi were abuzz with the phrase. University students quoted it on campus walls, calling Traoré the uncompromising voice of a new Africa. In Ouagadougou, a crowd gathered at nightfall to chant the line holding candles as if it were scripture. Meanwhile, Western media reacted with alarm. A French editorial called the statement reckless populism, while a Washington think tank dismissed it as theatrical and unsustainable. But the very intensity of the backlash revealed the threat the idea posed to long-standing structures of control. Inside the chamber, silence once again prevailed. The walkouts had removed the loudest critics, leaving behind a body still divided but shaken. Delegates realized they were no longer discussing a symbolic dream. They were facing a decision that could reshape the dynamics of the 21st century. The climax had been reached. The old guard had attempted to resist. Traoré had replied with words that were not easily forgotten. And now the question loomed over the African Union like an approaching storm. What will happen next? The turning point arrived when the Nigerian delegation requested the floor. Nigeria, with more than 220 million citizens and the largest economy on the continent, has long been viewed as the weight that can tilt Africa's balance. Every eye in the chamber turned toward them, waiting for words that could either steady or shatter the fragile debate. The Nigerian minister spoke plainly without flourish. We will not ignore the call for Afro Money. Nigeria is prepared to join a pilot program to test the feasibility of a shared African currency. The effect was immediate and explosive. Applause broke out across half the chamber. Some delegates rose to their feet in astonishment. Others hurried to congratulate the minister. For the first time during the meeting, Ibrahim Traoré's vision was no longer a solitary plea in the wild. It had gained a partner with enough influence to help it succeed. Nigeria's announcement changed the entire equation. Economists knew the numbers well. Nigeria alone accounts for roughly 18% of Africa's gross domestic product. Its endorsement was not symbolic, it was structural. The idea of Afro money, once dismissed as idealistic, suddenly had the weight of Africa's largest market behind it. For smaller nations, Nigeria's step was both inspiring and intimidating. Leaders from landlocked states whispered among themselves, calculating what benefits or risks might follow if they aligned with this new monetary bloc. For those long tied to the West African CFA franc, the pressure grew unbearable. Would they stay aligned with Paris or shift towards Lagos, Ouagadougou, in the vision of a united continent? Outside the chamber, the news spread rapidly. In the streets of Abuja, students and workers celebrated with chants of "One Africa, One Money." In Accra and Bamako, activists held rallies displaying banners that proclaimed, "Afro money means African freedom." In contrast, business elites in Dar es Salaam and Abidjan voiced concern, warning that rushing into monetary union could destabilize fragile economies. But the symbolism was undeniable. Once Nigeria moved, the dream had crossed from rhetoric into reality. Afro money was no longer an idea. It was a pilot project. It was a challenge that could not be easily buried by cautious speeches or diplomatic walkouts. The chamber felt the ground shift beneath it. For the first time, Africa's most powerful state had placed its full weight on the scale of unity. The Nigerian declaration did not remain confined within the walls of the African Union. Within hours, international news agencies ran headlines. Nigeria tips the balance on Afro money. Financial markets in Paris and London started the following day with a sense of unpredictability. Analysts on business news channels debated whether African reserves stored overseas would soon be brought back to support a new currency. In various African capitals, the political repercussions were felt right away. In Senegal, opposition parties seized upon Nigeria's move, accusing the government of standing idle while history is being made. In Mali and Burkina Faso, citizens filled city squares, waving flags and chanting slogans that linked Afro money to independence. Social media from Johannesburg to Nairobi echoed with debates, some hopeful, others cautious. Civil society groups quickly stepped into the fray. Youth organizations framed Afro money as more than economics. It was a symbol of dignity. For decades, many young Africans had been told that their currencies were weak, that their borders were permanent, that their future was limited. Now, for the first time, they saw a vision of a continent that could act as one. But not everyone was convinced. Bankers in Ivory Coast warned that dismantling the CFA franc would cut deeply into financial stability, potentially spurring inflation. Veteran politicians concerned about losing the support of Western nations labeled Afro money as a perilous fantasy. They issued warnings about sanctions, the flight of capital, and the potential collapse of delicate state budgets. Their words carried weight, but their tone betrayed a deeper anxiety that the structures they had long depended upon were slipping away. At the grassroots level, the debate took on a more personal face. Traders at border towns spoke openly about what a single currency could mean. No more paying fees in 3 or 4 different currencies. No more waiting in line for hours at customs posts. No more profits drained by exchange losses. For ordinary Africans, the argument was not theoretical. It was about bread, school fees, and medicine. In the African Union Chamber, the aftershocks of Nigeria's decision lingered. Delegates who had previously opposed the idea found themselves in a difficult position due to the new circumstances. To oppose Afro money now meant to stand against the continent's largest economy and the millions of people who supported it. The political center of gravity had shifted, and no amount of cautious maneuvering could entirely reverse it. The tide was turning. What began as one man's declaration was now a continental reckoning. The announcement of Afro money reverberated far beyond Africa's borders. In Paris, the shock was palpable. French officials, long accustomed to the comfort of the CFA franc system, convened emergency meetings. Editorials in leading French newspapers described Nigeria's decision as a seismic challenge to France's economic influence in Africa. For decades, Paris had depended on the CFA franc as both a financial and political tether. Now that tether was being cut. In London, analysts at the London School of Economics warned that Afro money, if successfully launched, could undermine Europe's trade leverage across the continent. They observed that Europe gets nearly 20% of its essential resources from Africa. If these deals started using Afro money instead of euros or dollars, the power dynamics in commodity markets would shift across the Atlantic. In Washington, the response was more pronounced. At a policy roundtable held by a prominent think tank, one speaker declared, "If Afro money succeeds, Africa will no longer be merely a recipient of aid. It will become a bloc with the ability to negotiate as an equal." For American policymakers, that shift carried both opportunity and risk. An economically unified Africa could open vast markets for trade, but it could also reduce Washington's ability to influence individual states. Financial institutions were equally uneasy. Wall Street analysts pointed out that Africa holds some of the world's largest reserves of critical minerals: cobalt, lithium, platinum, essential for modern technology. If these resources began trading in Afro money, demand for the United States dollar could weaken in global markets. A respected economist cautioned, "The issue is not if Afro money will be strong initially. The concern is whether it initiates an unstoppable trend toward de-dollarization." Media outlets heightened the sense of tension. The Washington Post described Traoré's speech as a radical gamble. The Financial Times asked bluntly, "Is Africa preparing to challenge the global monetary order?" Even in Beijing, commentators observed the development with interest, suggesting that Afro money might eventually align with China's efforts to expand the yuan's role in international trade. For the first time, Africa's internal debate was dictating headlines abroad. The world was no longer watching Africa as a passive continent. It was now reacting to Africa as a decisive actor. While governments and financial institutions debated in boardrooms, the wider world began to sense something deeper, a shift in Africa's image. For generations, global media had portrayed Africa primarily as a place of crisis wars, poverty, aid appeals. Yet after Nigeria's announcement and Ibrahim Traoré's defiant words, the story started to change. A prominent German newspaper in Berlin published the headline, "From Colony to Contender, Africa's Bold Currency Move." In New York, a columnist noted that the world might soon find itself negotiating with Africa rather than just providing aid. International civil society responded with curiosity and, in some cases, admiration. Activist groups in Latin America drew parallels between Afro money and their own calls for regional independence from the United States dollar. In Asia, commentators highlighted how African leaders were echoing the integration path once taken by the European Union. The question was no longer whether Africa was capable, but whether the world was ready to accept it as an equal. The cultural impact was also visible. Musicians, writers, and filmmakers began referencing Afro money as a symbol of pride. In Paris, African diaspora youth marched with banners reading, "Our currency, our future." In Washington, students at historically black universities hosted debates on whether Afro money could be the economic equivalent of the civil rights movement, a step toward dignity long denied. Yet doubts persisted. Economists in Tokyo and Brussels cautioned that Africa's infrastructure and governance structures remain fragile. They warned of inflation, corruption, and instability. The skepticism was real, but it was overshadowed by a growing recognition that something irreversible had been set in motion. Even among ordinary people abroad, the change was felt. Travelers in Nairobi hotels or Johannesburg airports overheard conversations that were once unimaginable. Business people speculating about the exchange rate of Afro money. Young professionals asking how soon they could open an account. For the first time in living memory, the phrase African news carried not only stories of despair, but also of ambition, strategy, and self-determination. Ibrahim Traoré's declaration had broken through the old narrative curtain. The world could no longer see Africa as merely a background. It was now a stage where history was being written, and the actors were Africans themselves. Just when it seemed the debate would remain a stalemate, half the chamber energized by Afro money, the other half, entrenched in caution, an unexpected voice shifted the balance. The delegation from Ghana, long considered cautious and pragmatic, requested to speak. The Ghanaian representative delivered a calm, measured speech instead of an impassioned one. "We cannot forget our history. We must not overlook the risks," he stated. "However, we cannot also deny that the colonial legacy of Berlin from 1884 has constrained us for too long. Ghana will commit to a continental task force to design Afro money within the next 12 months." The effect was stunning. Ghana had not aligned itself blindly with Nigeria or Burkina Faso, but it had endorsed the momentum. The commitment of resources, expertise, and political will signaled to hesitant nations that this was no longer mere symbolism. It was policy taking form. In the hall, applause swelled. Some leaders, sensing the tide, began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Delegates who had once dismissed the proposal as a radical dream now faced the reality that two of West Africa's most influential states, Nigeria and Ghana, were aligning with Traore. Outside, the news spread across Africa with great speed. Radio stations in Accra reported it as a significant development, while Pan-African commentators declared that the legacy of the Berlin Conference had finally been challenged. Ordinary citizens who had previously been doubtful started to believe that Afro money could become a reality. The twist was not that Traore had spoken boldly. Everyone expected that. The twist was that others, once hesitant, were stepping forward to carry the banner with him. As the chamber adjusted to Ghana's announcement, all eyes turned back to the man who had set this storm in motion. Ibrahim Traoré sat still, his posture calm, but the shift in atmosphere was undeniable. Only hours earlier, he had been treated as a young radical and impatient soldier turned president, challenging veterans of politics. Now with Nigeria and Ghana stepping into his vision, he was being seen differently, not as a lone voice, but as a symbol. Delegates whispered it quietly at first. Perhaps this day will be recorded in the history as the start of a unified Africa. Even his opponents were compelled to acknowledge that Traoré had shifted the terms of the discussion. The concept of Afro money was no longer his exclusive idea. It was becoming the shared dream of a generation, and he was the one who had lit the flame. Across Africa, the perception of Traoré began to change. In Bamako, murals appeared overnight portraying him beside Nkrumah and Mandela. In Lagos, university students held vigils praising his courage. On radio stations in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, commentators debated whether he had become the voice of an Africa no longer content with survival, but determined to lead. Even abroad, the symbolism was clear. Western outlets labeled him the face of a new African radicalism, while African diaspora communities called him the mirror of our unfulfilled hopes. The plot twist was fully realized. What had started as a contentious statement in a private meeting had made Ibrahim Traoré an iconic figure. He was no longer just the president of Burkina Faso. He was becoming the embodiment of a continent daring to believe in its unity. The chamber emptied slowly that night, but the echo of Traoré's words lingered long after the delegates had gone. Across Africa, people spoke of a future that no longer seemed distant or impossible. Afro money was not yet born, but the idea had already ignited a fire that no border, no treaty, no outside power could easily extinguish. For the first time since Berlin in the year 1884 divided the continent with foreign ink, Africans were daring to imagine erasing those lines with their own hands. Farmers envisioned a market where their harvest could cross frontiers without barriers. Traders dreamed of keeping their profits without losing them to endless currency exchanges. Students dreamed of traveling with one passport, carrying not the legacy of division, but the promise of unity. Ibrahim Traoré's final remarks conveyed the significance of that commitment. "We do not seek permission to be free," he declared. "We have risen to claim it." If you believe that the spirit of Ibrahim Traoré is more than politics, that it is Africa's rebirth, share this story. Subscribe to this channel to follow a journey toward a continent no longer bowed. God bless Africa.